They are the type of folk who are, for all intensive purposes, seemingly church people, good Christian church people.
We find ourselves stuck with the murder of the congregation and the murder of our spirituality.
They are typically responsible people, very active in the life of the church and in the community.
I believe they operate in such a dimension and in such a way that the things that they do in the life of a church, they would never do in public. I believe they operate best under the cloak of darkness, if you will.
They are underhanded. They will smile at your face while they are sharpening the dagger at the same time.
Our congregations are now troubled by 1 or 2, maybe 8 or 10 members who insist on doing things their way.
Clergy from every major denomination in Canada, as well as many clergy in the U.S., clergy in Europe, in Africa, have all called us to tell us that they too are suffering the abuses in their congregations, in their church hierarchy, and that no one is helping them, that they feel abandoned, they feel forsaken. And so this clearly indicated to us that what we're dealing with here is not one denominational problem. We have a pandemic of abuse of clergy.
People who act with that sort of vicious heart within those congregations often are called clergy killers. And sometimes that's metaphorical and sometimes it's literal. Clergy dying in the church as a consequence of their service.
A clergy killer is someone who is so intent upon destroying or running off a member of the clergy that they will stop at virtually nothing, including destroying the ministries of the church or even the church itself.
A clergy killer most often is a part of a congregation. On the exterior, they're no different than anybody else. Most often, they're supporting members, they're actively involved in the life of that community. So on the exterior, I think people trust them.
Most of these folks are sharp. They don't come in with horns and a pitchfork or anything like that. They look like the rest of us. As a matter of fact, they're probably very articulate people who are in good standing in the community and in the church. But there's something in their background, a hatred of authority that has opened up the door for evil in their life. And when they get the chance, when the opportunity is right, they will take it and go after that authority figure, and in the church, it's usually the pastor.
The clergy killer has no compunction about using whatever means that are at their disposal to achieve their ends. They will tell lies. They will smear the clergy person publicly, often in newspapers and on the radio and on the television. They will do anything to destroy their reputation. It is truly evil when we see this and when we see these people being destroyed, and in many cases in a completely dishonest campaign.
A clergy killer is a person who wants to assert their understanding of what is important, either for their own psychological need or what they perceive to be important for the church, at the cost of the clergymen themselves. A clergy killer is a person whose goal is to get rid of a clergy person, and they stop at nothing. It's a very evil phenomenon.
I have been on the front lines. I've experienced it myself. I've seen what it's done to my colleagues. I've seen what it's done to my mentors. Two of my mentors are dead of heart attacks at the hands of constant attacks from clergy killers.
There are evil people, 1 or 2, sometimes 8 or 10 in a congregation who are willing to give themselves to evil purposes for their own narcissistic benefits. They are aggressive, they are hostile, they are mean-spirited, but they will sit in a pew and be as kind and gentle as you can imagine. But when the pastor is in their sights, they are killers. And the goal of evil in the clergy killer phenomenon is to get the pastor, to force them out of the church, and to even use other members of the congregation to help do it. The goal of the clergy killer is not to make us uncomfortable, but to kill us. And I use that word killer intentionally. When clergy killers are after a pastor, they do not stop until the damage is done and until there's a death, either metaphorically or actually.
The Reverend Dr. Robert Matten was defamed by church leaders who publicly criticized him. The United Church held a vote to terminate Robert without cause. Knowing the United Church's own policies left him defenseless, we did the one thing that we could. We prayed.
This from a United Church minister in Saskatchewan who sent a message of support. Her prayers are with us. May the peace and love of God go with you and all our brothers and sisters, including Robert and family.
Throughout the summer before school started, I kept nagging at Bob to clean out his office, because when he had to vacate the church, all of those materials that he had accumulated, all of his notes and sermon ideas, his plans and hopes and dreams for his ministry, all had to come home, and they landed in his office in our house. And it was exploding. It could not hold everything. And so I kept nagging him all summer to clean out his office. And he never did it. So after his first week in school, I finally said, okay, this is it. You got to clean it out now. So the two of us went up there, and we eventually filled 5 buckets of material to throw out. Wednesday, Wednesday is garbage day here. And Wednesday morning, September the 17th, Bob took all those materials out to the curb for the garbage truck to pick up. All his 8 boxes of his life and his dreams in ministry. And the garbage truck took them away. And he went to school that day. And he came home for supper. And then he said to me he didn't feel that well, but he had some homework to do, so let's go outside for a walk. And about 2 blocks from our home, he collapsed on the sidewalk. Never regained consciousness. He was dead of a heart attack.
As I entered the building this morning to tape this interview, I heard about the untimely death of Reverend Dr. Robert Matten. That was quite shocking. A man who's 55 years old, who dedicated his life to the church, and when he was faced with major problems by the constituency that he services, the church failed him, the hierarchy of the church failed Reverend Matten. And the stress he was experiencing was added to by the lack of response by the hierarchy of the church. And I was just so saddened this morning to hear that his passing with a heart attack at the age of 55. And I just want to say as sincerely as I can to his wife Lois and his children how sad we are and how great an individual he was. They should be immensely proud of him and his efforts to carry out the work of the church firstly, but also his recognition of and his efforts to ensure that clergy had an independent union to represent them. He was a great human being. And I just offer the condolences and the support for the family as they go through this trying time of the 255,000 members of the Canadian Auto Workers Union.
He just collapsed one night when he was out for a walk with his partner. He died right there. You feel like blaming the church, and it's the church's fault. But you can't say that he went through something that was entirely unjust, that has no place in the church. And you can say that his whole sense of calling and love for the church was broken in half. So it's right to say that he was a broken man. And his collapse, his heart attack and collapse, was, I think it's right to say, was virtually encouraged by the church. He is a story where the church breaks your heart as a minister and breaks your life, does nothing, and then literally watches you die.
My name is the Reverend Dr. Robert Matten, and I am a minister of Word, Sacrament, and Pastoral Care. I was ordained by Saskatchewan Conference of the United Church of Canada at Nipawin, Saskatchewan on May the 29th, 1988. Beyond my own woundedness, I feel great remorse for all who suffer this loss with me. I pray that the church and all of us here might learn from this experience and ensure that it does not repeat itself. I would like to remind my ministry colleagues of the importance of speaking out, as expressed by Martin Niemöller, who referred to the terrors of Nazi Germany. First, they came for the communist, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialist, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionist, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Speak out. Take a stand.
About a month after Bob died, I got a card in the mail from a dear woman from the Binbrook congregation that Bob had served at. In her card, she expressed her condolences, and she also talked about the lovely memorial service that the congregations had held in Bob's memory. It was the first time I had ever heard that there had been a memorial service in memory of my husband at the congregations. I didn't know what to do next, but I thought, well, I'm going to write them a letter and ask them what went on at this service, and ask them why I wasn't invited or why I wasn't told that they were having this service. It took almost 2 months before I got a response. And the minister who led the service told me that they didn't want me there, that the congregation felt that it would be too uncomfortable for some of them to have me in attendance, so they chose not to tell me that it was going to happen. As a lifelong United Church member, active United Church member, I fully expected to get support from the United Church when my husband died. I'm still astounded that I didn't get any of that support from the congregation, not from the presbytery, not from conference. Apart from a sympathy card, I've not had any phone calls. I've had no casseroles dropped off at the door. I've had no one visiting me in the capacity of presbytery or conference or the congregation. Bob was a minister in good standing for 20 years. There's been no recognition of his ministry by the church. To be left out of that faith community when I desperately needed it the most is heart-wrenching. Fortunately, I did have support from my neighbors, from my family, from the ministers supporting the clergy union drive, but I really needed support from my congregation, from my church, from my husband's employer, from the presbytery that he was a part of for so many years. And it wasn't there.
If a church becomes chronically toxic, that it develops a reputation for just killing clergy in a serial manner, that it becomes a serial killer, we might say, then that church needs to be allowed to die.
The clergy killer does evil. The clergy killer role is evil. The person in that role does evil. And they do it with abandonment. They do it with sadism. They do it to take out and take down and destroy.
Clergy killers, are they possessed in a demonic way? Yes. They don't spin their heads around in public, and they don't spew blood. Horns don't grow out of their heads. But what they do and how they do it, and what they say and how they say it, is every bit as frightening as what you'd see in a movie theater.
Evil is not the Hollywood traditional pitchfork and horn type evil. It's often the distortion of good causes and high-sounding ideas in such a way that they're evil outcomes. And we need to understand that evil is often not about specific evil behaviors. It's about distortion of good causes.
In a clergy killer case, it's pretty compelling to think that they are possessed of something that is not good because of the way that they act in such an obsessive way, a way that is totally without reference to truth.
One of the big tragedies is the super conservative Christians make demons look funny and the devil have a tail and horns. That becomes ludicrous. The ultra liberals kind of say evil are mistakes. There's no force of evil. There's no personal campaign of evil. They're both wrong. These images of possession, these images of the devil show evil has an agenda. Evil can take over some of the best of people, can destroy some of the best of intentions, and by golly, get to the Holy of Holies, get to the people of God, and win that battle.
Everybody is a sinner. Everyone sins. But there comes a point where there's contrition, there's sorrow, there's resolve not to commit that same sin again. A secular definition of evil could very well be this: that when someone repeatedly commits a sin, knowing that it's hurting an individual or a group, and they find pleasure from it, that is evil. You can do everything you can to stop that person, to correct that individual. But when they consistently and constantly inflict pain on another individual or a group of people and derive pleasure from that, I think that's evil.
Sometimes, with no explanation at all, you encounter somebody that you think is on retainer to the evil spirit, and who, without any personal gratification that you can see, is just deciding that whereas there are these godly principles and these noble virtues, there's a bunch of crock, they'd say, and I'm going to expose it. I'm going to strike out and destroy the churches if I can, and I'm going to start with the preacher. I wish I knew why, but there seems to be some sinister force in the universe that recruits some people to be the nemesis to heaven itself. I wish I could explain it. I at least will say, I think it's real.
If we ask the name of what's going on in this squabble in this congregation, and the name comes back clergy killer, then we have a name and we have a set of recommendations we can follow, and we know better how to handle it. It still may be painful, but at least we know the name and we can start to control it.
The term clergy killer is strong, but is not broad enough. The clergy killer brings about the division of the house between those who are for the clergy and those who are against the clergy. The clergy killer affects whether the church is simply a sociological context for playing out one's power struggle, or whether it is a spiritual institution at all. The clergy killer kills the congregation, kills the spirit, and kills in some way the community's respect for that which was once supposed to be its brightest light in regards to redeeming the society. So clergy killers is not too strong a term. It is too limited.
When we go to a doctor and he says, Monsignor, what can I do for you? What's the problem? I'm not going to sit there and say, I don't know. I hurt. Well, where do you hurt? I don't know. It makes no sense.
That's right.
You go to the doctor and you say, Doctor, I hurt in my right shoulder. Doctor, I wake up with a migraine over my right eye, and by noon, the whole top of my head is aching where I feel like I'm going to pass out. When you identify the problem for the physician, then he applies therapy or medication. That's the way to fix the problem. That's the way they heal. And I think that's where we need to call out clergy killers and say, this is the problem.
Thank you, Jim.
And this is what we're going to do.
That's right.
The churches that have moved through with clergy killers have named it in the places that matter and have stood against it when they see it, because they recognize the markers of seduction. They recognize the inductive markers, and they have a pastor that is willing to work with them.
If folks like us who know what human beings are capable of doing cannot stand up to what's going on with clergy killers, toxic congregations, then who is going to be able to do that? If those of us that are battle scarred and have our calluses don't know how to deal with this, what is going to happen to the young person who answers the call from God early in life, goes right on to seminary, hits their first congregation when they're 25, 27 years old? It's no wonder that we don't last.
As pastors, we have to be willing to confront the clergy killers. We have to confront them. If we don't confront them, if we're not willing to take a stand against them, then they are able to accomplish even more of what they're trying to accomplish.
Actually, naming the clergy killer can be a fearful thing. I think you mentioned, Randy, about not wanting to judge the person. We are trained not to judge the person. And judge not that ye be not judged, but you still need to call evil evil. You are acting evilly, sir, may be a better way to say it than to say you are evil. What you are doing is evil, and it will not be tolerated. I think if that is what naming the person means, often it does need to be done. It needs to be done because of this inordinate power, not some general sermon on evil. That may help, but you need to name the evil, and that can mean naming the person that's carrying that evil campaign.
Until clergy begin to name the evil, talk about clergy killers when it occurs, do the work beforehand in preparing a church for conflict and conflict management, then we're doomed to suffer the consequences of good ministers leading the ministry, of evil winning over good in a temporary way, and it's a horrible type of leadership. Leadership in the church today requires a new type of commitment to being willing to confront evil, including clergy killers.
Why in the world was I not told this years ago so that I could have dealt with it? As a matter of fact, after I went through that retreat, I went back to the congregation where a clergy killer was trying to get me out, and I took control of the situation. I went before the congregation on a Sunday morning and told them some of the things that were going on. And I said, we really need to pray about this situation. And a lot of things changed. A lot of people said, we had no idea that this was going on.
If you want to imitate the Master, who identified evil, who exorcised demons out of people, that's what we need to do today as a church. I can say that. In imitation of Jesus Christ, we've got to do it today. We got to identify where the evil is, and we have to exorcise. We have to get rid of it. In the same way that he drove out people out of the temple because they changed his father's house into a den of thieves. We got to drive them out. We got to confront it.
Elijah, Joshua, Moses, Jesus, Paul, Peter, among a whole host of spiritual giants within the faith, were risk takers. They were truth tellers. They were honorable men, and among those ranks, women of God that took huge risks, told the truth, threw a light on evil, challenged the status quo, and advanced the purposes of God as a result. And we're losing that today, if we haven't lost it completely already.
I think with cultural contextual shifts, in many parts of the culture in America and in Europe, the church's relevance is much, much less. People just don't pay attention. They don't care. They don't show up. And it's not that they don't ever think about having spiritual needs, it's just that's not the place they go. And so what happens is that the people that are within it are still attached to demanding of the church that it feed them, that it bring them the sense of satisfaction that they need, that it has this peace in it. And I think that we're seeing the church then keep taking care of itself and becoming more and more irrelevant to the culture outside. And the more energy that it has to spend on taking care of itself, the less energy it has, and it dies. And I think we've seen the death of the church, and it's now feeding on itself with clergy killers.
We're watching a horrible dropout rate in the ministry today. Most people don't live a full career in the ministry. And that's serious because that's a lot of years of education, that's a lot of time invested for someone who feels that they are not then called to the ministry.
There was once an image of the church and the pastor as actually the center of the community. And one of the highest vocations one could aspire to were to be a leader of a congregation. And in those days, seminaries could pick and choose the brightest and the best. But what happened even before the 60s and the 70s is, as Harvey Cox from Harvard University, who wrote the book about the secular city, we as a modern society began to live much more into scientific explanations of things. And the God premise was increasingly pushed to the corners in what was called the age of secularization, in which it meant that most things that people cared about were related to powers, values, and materials that they could manipulate, that they could define, and processes that they could predict. And the mysterious and sacred values began to be thought, well, those things were significantly pushed into the corners of the society.
The church should be that sacred place, that sacred fellowship, that sacred trust. It's not the workplace.
That's right.
If there is no distinguishing between the workplace and the church, then we've lost something incredibly valuable and precious.
And the church is voluntary. We are clerical leaders in a voluntary institution. You can say, well, I'm free to go to work or not, but you're not if you want to keep the job. You are free to come and go in the church. You are free to be supposedly safe. You are free to fight honestly together. You are invited to be a voluntary community of faith based on justice, integrity, radical love.
A person who has a difference of opinion with the pastor has exactly that, a difference of opinion, and it doesn't go beyond that. A clergy killer not only has a difference of opinion, but desires to, in some way, compromise the ministry of the pastor, to injure the pastor, to throw a negative light on the pastor to the degree that they are ineffective.
Where you have diversity, so much diversity as we have today, and everybody is thinking whatever they think is the right way, namely God's way, then it's very hard to make peace out of that, because the typical response to disagreements is dissension, and it becomes an argument, a competition, and if I really believe deeply that I am right and you are wrong, then the peace of Jesus doesn't even apply. It becomes something out there instead of something we've internalized.
I have been ordained a priest for over 20 years now, and over those 20 years of active ministry in the church, there have certainly been parishioners who have had differences in opinion than my own. Having a difference in opinions is certainly acceptable. I can listen to my parishioners, and parishioners listen to me, and sometimes we agree to disagree.
I have had serious disagreements with people, but we were able to work through those disagreements to either resolve the issue or just to agree to disagree, and we were able to go on and have a life together.
When we talk about the victimization of pastors, we are talking about the physical, the mental, the spiritual, and this spiritual dimension is terrifying for pastors because they believe, and realistically most of them are, called by God for this spiritual work. And God has agreed to empower them to do it well, beyond what human beings can do by themselves.
I've talked to colleagues who have been physically threatened by a clergy killer that has actually called them to partake in a fisticuffs, if you will. These are situations that I find quite alarming because obviously a clergy killer doesn't respect the position of a minister. The clergy killer has as his or her goal destruction and mayhem.
I have experienced attempts at this myself in my church, and thank God the circumstances were such that I was able to survive it and not to feel the full brunt. But it is hard to imagine just what it's like to be under this type of relentless attack by people who you are there to serve.
And what you experience is this terrible feeling of what have I done wrong? Why me? You examine yourself and you think, I'm doing the very best I can do with the gifts and graces God has given me. And why is this happening anyway?
The damage can be the damage of the deepest type of trauma, because here you feel a call from God into ministry. You do the best you can to love people and serve them as a religious leader, and then you get attacked. and you feel other people slipping away in the congregation.
The pastors that come in here that have been abused by clergy killer or community people in the clergy, that the killer crowd, often feel psychologically the fragmentation. It's a sense of right up against the edge of not being, I'm not worth anything anymore, the worthlessness. They feel the anguish, which is an anger that yearns to get it back, get back the thing that they went into the calling for. I know I had it, and I can't have it, and it brings them to this turmoil.
The ironic thing about clergy killers is they are so obsessed with getting their way that they're willing to do anything to anyone to get their way, and even if it means themselves being tossed out of heaven and being thrown into the gates of hell to do it, they will.
People who do the bullying, clergy killers, they're fearful people.
Yes. Underneath, they're cowards.
They are.
They're terrified.
Yep.
They want a victim.
Same thing with anybody who would abuse a young person today and bully them. Same thing with adults.
Mm-hmm.
When they bully anybody else, they're no different than anybody who would bully a young person. Mm-hmm. They're filled with fear. They're cowards.
Well, I know that the people who get caught up in the clergy killing phenomenon come into it with a great deal of righteous rage.
I don't see somebody with horns and a pitchfork and a pointed tail. I see a human being, but almost always in their eyes I can see an indication that they are thinking differently than a good person does.
I don't think they were always clergy killers. I think that they were regular church members who grew up in the church who probably did love Christ to some extent, or want to love Christ, and somehow in their life they, instead of repenting of their sin, have let some sin or some evil into their lives, and then they've grown into this. And a part of what evil does is deception, and these people are deceived. They probably think that they're saved. They probably think that they're Christians. They probably think that they're doing good. But when the opportunity arises for them to go after the authority figure in the church, which is the minister, then all of those things in their background, even though they can use them, they're going after the minister, and they will do anything. And the difference between them and the rest of the congregation is they don't care. They have nothing to lose.
The worst situation is not simply that a clergy person is under assault by clergy killers, but sometimes I get the impression that people who feel that God has let them down, either in the way they were born, whether they had defects or whether they were not quite as strong or as beautiful as they wanted to be, that folks who feel a disappointment in their life situation may blame it on God. And something wants to get back at God for having mistreated me. When that happens, it's so hard to find God. If you want to hit at God, where would you go? Well, the very closest approximation is God's representative. So then, people who are disappointed with life may see in the clergy person God's representative. And if I can't get at God, I can get at this representative. And therefore, clergy are often under assault from that kind of person.
My experience has been that when a clergy killer is recruiting other people to join their ranks, they usually go after a person or an individual who has a beef with the pastor. They go after the weakest link, so to speak.
I think that a clergy killer usually wants to pick up 2 or 3 at least sidekicks, wannabe clergy killers, for whatever reason that certain person would want to do that. But they like the attention, they like the feeling of power that goes along with that person, they like being associated with that person, and I think they do attract people.
At some point in these types of campaigns that are taken on by clergy killers against their spiritual leaders, it breaks out of this sort of whispering, behind the scenes conniving and scheming that takes place. And it begins to break out more publicly in the congregation and eventually may even spread out into the community.
The clergy killer will find others that'll say, yeah, and it's been that way, and I don't want it to be that way either. Let's go after them. Let's go after them all, whether it's the church board or whether it's just that one clergy themselves. But usually the clergy is the identified authority that's disappointed will get the heat, will get the knife.
When you think about what the average parishioner does when a clergy killer gets active, and I don't just mean with a couple of people, but they really become active in the congregation. They mount their agenda to get rid of someone. I hate to call it a herd mentality or a mob mentality. I've seen people do that even when I know they didn't entirely agree with someone who was on a clergy killing campaign, but yet they just follow along.
Ministers who are trying to follow procedure, they will inform the congregational board. And the response is apathy. That's so-and-so, Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so. He or she has always been like that. Don't worry about it. And so suddenly you can't turn to anyone. You've used the procedure, the appropriate procedure, and it's proven to be untrustworthy. Now you're isolated, and you're still dealing with the problem.
I believe that one of the primary reasons why congregations appear to be apathetic and unsympathetic towards their pastors who are being attacked by clergy killers is because they're uninformed. They don't know what a clergy killer is. They don't understand the depth and the magnitude of what their pastors are going through.
Maybe it's the fear of the very evil that exists among them that's perpetrating the destruction on the pastor.
When a people abuse and kill their spiritual leader, that is damaging not only to that community of faith, but the surrounding community as well. And when we now have this happening to thousands of spiritual leaders, there is a ripple effect that simply cannot be ignored. When you kill your shaman, you kill yourself.
Congregational life is nothing but politics. We have returned to the days of the Pharisees and compromised our spiritual integrity and strength.
Many of our bishops, I am saddened to say, have lost their faith. They have lost touch with the teaching of Jesus Christ. Many of them, I am afraid to say, have rejected the authority of God's Word.
I think one of the big problems in terms of the whole clergy killer phenomenon is an institutional problem. And the main authorities of the church, be they bishops, be they head rabbis, be they superintendents, are essentially trained to keep the ship of state afloat, keep the business functioning. And when you live in a widely secular society, the values of those societies start to permeate the institution of the church. And sadly, I think the leaders of the church then do a dualistic split. There's the spiritual and there's the physical. The physical is run like a business, the spiritual ends up being feel-good. The bishops cannot be pastors to pastors as long as their main function is to keep the economy balanced in the institutional church.
Bishops have become more institutional managers. They speak, in many cases, primarily through their press agents, their communications people who massage the things they say to fit with whatever the prevailing political climate is, and to make sure that none of the major constituencies are offended or challenged by anything that they say.
Church is about relationships. It always has been, it always will be. Certainly a relationship with Christ, a personal relationship with God. But in a community of faith, it's relationships with other people. My experience has been that developing those relationships with one another is more difficult the larger the church, the parish, the community. I think that's one of the challenges that bishops face. They run dioceses, whole districts, and it's difficult to build those relationships for them. But I also know that as challenging as that is when they run these large churches, these large dioceses, we're in the trenches. And when we have generals who take care of us, we'll fight to the very end for the sake of the gospel and for the church.
I would see spiritual warfare as saying that this is a psychological issue that is deeper than just the secular world. This is something that goes to the very soul, to the very meaning, the very spirit, the very essence of what it means to be a human being. And it's an attack at the deepest level of our humanity.
The battleground is now inside the life of the church. It used to be the battleground was the outside attacking the church. Now the battle's on the inside, within people that sit in our very pews. In essence, yeah, it's a spiritual battle within our own selves.
Combat has been fought at many different levels. It's been fought from the air, it's been fought on land, it's been fought from the sea. I believe the same thing holds true in spiritual warfare. There are different levels and many different tactics for the evil one to accomplish his work. The end result is the same: the destruction of Christianity, the division of congregations.
That sometimes there are times when ministers have to be intentional to preach sermons that educate and inform members of the congregation of the reality of spiritual warfare, of the spiritual warfare that they will experience as individuals who are following after Jesus Christ, that the enemy will certainly come against them in ways that they need to be aware of and understand.
A lot of people who allow Satan into their lives in some way or another, to whatever degree they do that, I think it does deal with their mind.
Bishops are heads of an institution as well as a church. And sometimes I'm afraid that they become so enamored, or enmeshed, perhaps is a better word, for their corporate position. And corporate positions are built on bureaucracy and funds and resources. They become more concerned with their financial situation and their power structure overall than they are with the welfare of an individual pastor.
The leadership of the church, bishops and superintendents, are willing to crucify pastors, ministers, rabbis, in order to preserve relationships that they have with powerful congregants, and also to preserve the finances within the church. And I'm not just talking about individual local church budgets. I'm talking about money that extends far beyond the local church.
Clergies are expendable. Churches aren't. They want to make sure that the money from the church keeps coming into the denominational agency. Churches can replace ministers, and ministers can find another church. And I think it's that flippant attitude that doesn't really realize the devastation that's going on in the lives of congregations and ministers and their families.
Somewhere our bishops have lost that sense of calling. As I've said before, in many ways, they have become institutional leaders. They have become spokespersons for particular political agendas.
In the church, it's peace at all costs. So when there's problems, the best thing to do is to try to make it sound like there's not really a problem and hope it'll go away.
What makes it so difficult for the clergy under attack is not just that he's under attack, but that the hierarchy of the church lets him down and doesn't come to his rescue or doesn't try to aid and sometimes blame him, and then turn around and accuse him of not being spiritual enough, not being adequate enough, while they seem convinced that they are right.
When I was wrestling with clergy killers, I never felt that spiritual energy from the leadership of our church that I had first experienced when I was being ordained. There were times that we prayed together, but I always knew or felt that my ministry was in question. I always felt this eye kind of watching over my shoulder.
I would say that anyone who has worked in a church for any period of time and who has eyes to see will have seen people who are at that level of evil, which we could classify as demonic possession.
A demonic possession is, in my opinion, when a force outside of that person takes over their thinking, their being, their disposition, their mannerisms, their personality, and it changes them. And suddenly they're not who you used to know them as. They're different. It's the same body, the same face, but a very different mechanism on the inside.
I think people will determine evil as being a manifestation of an evil spirit. They will see a person's pride, a person's greed or selfishness as being evil.
I don't know if I believe in demonic possession in the sense of The Exorcist, but I certainly have seen people who, without a doubt, are truly evil.
I believe that clergy killers are used by evil to a lot of different degrees, some more than others. Are there clergy killers out there that are possessed? There probably are. I haven't run into one I thought was completely possessed, but some that were farther along than others.
I believe that it is possible for a person to become possessed by evil intentions and evil motivations. And if that is best understood as an evil spirit, as opposed to the Holy Spirit, then yes, I think a person could be possessed by that.
I think we can remind ourselves that Jesus cast out actual demons. The exorcism movement proves that we can do that too with God's calling and empowerment. But the thing we're facing in the clergy killer is a human being possessed by evil intentionally and then perpetrating evil. And that is not the same as saying, I cast out a demon. It's saying, I stand against you and what you are doing to the kingdom of God.
And Paul gives us some language, powers and principalities.
Yes.
Those words are usable. This inordinate use of power over that Paul challenges. And we have some good theological writers that also use that kind of imagery and give it powerful relevance.
Clergy killers and mentally disordered or impaired people are not one and the same thing. The clergy killer, as different from the person who is impaired, chooses to do something evil. And as they continue to choose doing evil, just as Jesus said, we know a tree by its fruit. It starts to have rotten fruit or fruit that doesn't mature, and we know that tree is sick. The same thing with people who exhibit sinful and evil behavior. When we see them do it over and over, we know that we're dealing with something that needs to be taken care of spiritually. So even though mentally impaired people may have some tendency to fall into the clutches of a clergy killer, just because of their impairment does not make them clergy killers.
There are people with mental illness who come into the life of the church and can cause disruption. We ought to be able to pay attention to that and to deal with those folks and to realize there's a mental illness problem and to deal with them. Clergy killers, on the other hand, I think they go beyond that, and mental illness isn't enough to describe why they do what they do, because it doesn't make sense. Why are they going to such lengths to disrupt the church? Why are they going to such lengths to destroy a minister? Why are they going way beyond what you would think would be a normal person? I mean, even a person with a mental illness who gets upset in a church, you can usually deal with them. You can usually calm them down, talk to them, and find out what's wrong with them. And they're usually appreciative of the help that you give them. Clergy killers can't be helped in that sense because they've gone beyond what we would think of as mental illness. And evil is using them. To whatever degree, they're being used by evil.
You have to be very discerning and very careful, because you don't want to do further damage to someone who may be mentally ill by treating them as if they are a clergy killer. You could do more damage to them. Likewise, someone who is a clergy killer, to dismiss that as mental illness is just as devastating for yourself and your congregation.
Only a doctor could say whether a person is a schizophrenic or have some mental illness, but I believe that there are some clear characteristics of clergy killers that we have to look at, and we have to make intelligent and informed decisions and discernment to decide whether or not a person is a clergy killer.
I don't believe that in all situations, and probably in most situations, clergy killers are mentally ill. I do think they get caught up in roles that are incredibly destructive and incredibly vicious.
I don't know that a clergy killer has done the unpardonable sin and is beyond rehabilitation, but I think it takes a lot of work for a clergy killer to begin to acknowledge the evil within their own lives, the evil which they've done within a congregation. And I think it's very unlikely that in the midst of that particular congregation that they're going to encounter the truth and be able to be helped. I think clergy killers need to move to a different setting and hopefully get a good therapist and begin to work on the nature of what's going on within.
Now, I think there's probably a place where a person is so enmeshed in evil. It's not that Christ couldn't redeem them, but can they hear the call of Christ anymore? Have they so hardened their hearts that they can't even hear Christ calling them back? I think they could always be redeemed, but there's a place where the hardening of a person's heart gets to the place where they can't even hear the call of redemption anymore.
If I thought that clergy killers were evil to the core, I'd be tempted to give up on them. And as a pastor, I can't give up on anybody. I know that it could be that they are not redeemable, but that's not my call.
The church would have to admit that it can't save everybody. And that's not its job anyway. So it's a matter of giving up the grandiosity of thinking I can, as the pastor, bring this person into the fold. I can invite people, but I can't save them.
In today's silly, politically correct environment, the worst thing that you can do today is to offend someone.
Oh, yeah.
Quite frankly, some people need to be offended. It'd be good for them to be offended. It'd save their very soul.
Well, if you offend someone, you haven't loved them.
We've traded being theologically responsible for being politically correct and hypersensitive, and it's all shallow and false. And
you bet.
Cheap.
Yes. I think it's important to distinguish between evil and the clergy killer possessed by evil. As long as evil dominates that person, like Legion, the powerful demon, then it can't be done by us as clergy.
Oh, sure.
And I think the danger is, it's a very disciplined danger. The danger is the clergy killer will sap us of all our energy and play against us our assertive gospel values. We'll think, well, if we keep feeling we've got to keep loving, we've got to keep, they'll consume all our time. So that would be bad discipleship. They need to be confronted with the discipline of the church. And the discipline has a loving role, but if they're possessed by evil, they will not. But I cannot say a clergy killer can't be redeemed. A clergy killer indeed can be redeemed if evil is chased away, is thrown out the door that's possessing them.
This is why we take clergy killers seriously, because they choose evil, and evil, when it's perpetrated, does those two things over and over: harms people, body, mind, and spirit, and deprives them of the good that God intends.
I have known of some ministers who, under the stress of this type of attack, they've suffered heart attacks. There's some that have committed suicide under the allegations and the constant stress. So yes, a supreme price can be paid unnecessarily because of these clergy killers.
The clergy are out there reaching out, helping, and working in this environment on a constant basis. And you somehow think that that becomes the be-all and end-all, that you shouldn't worry about what's happening to yourself until it's too late, until it eats you alive, until the stress overtakes the clergy like it would anybody in a similar situation. And sometimes it's too late before they realize, gee, I don't have to put up with this. Why would I put up with this?
It's a crisis, and it goes through a crisis about much like a death. There's a shock, it isn't happening to me, a protest, it shouldn't be happening to me, and a period, I think, of just anguish and disorganization, where there's a searching. Well, then what is in it? What is left? What is there? I know it's for me. I know that the calling is still in me. What do I do with that? And it's a period of in isolation that leads many to depression and some to suicide. It's a spiritual loss.
I have seen marriages fail. I have seen wives leave the church because of clergy killers and because of the dynamics that's going on in a congregation at a time when their spouse is under this kind of attack. I have seen children who never recover their faith because of what they experienced happening to their father in ministry. It is a tragic situation when it happens.
Someone came to the parsonage, to the backyard, where I had built a wooden playset for my children and hooked a chain to it and pulled it around with the car and totally destroyed it and left it in tatters in the backyard. And this was not a random act of violence. This was intentional, because they didn't destroy any of the other play sets in any other backyards. And the most painful thing for me was when we got back, and there's my little 4-year-old daughter standing in the backyard crying, asking, "Why, Daddy? What did I do wrong?" I said, "You didn't do anything wrong, sweetie pie." Having to explain to your child what evil is at that age, I did not want to explain that to her at 4 years old. So I exposed it. I wrote an article about how painful it was to have to explain to a 4-year-old little girl about the reality of evil in this life by virtue of someone intentionally destroying her swing set. Why would anybody pick on a little girl? But they did.
I've talked to my wife and my son and my daughter about whether or not to go back into pastoral ministry after forced termination. all of them were skeptical. My son doesn't go to church now. My daughter doesn't go to church now. And both of them say that it's because of all the turmoil that went on, and that people would be allowed to do the evil that they did in the midst of all that, and nobody stopping them.
People call me Father. I know it's in a spiritual sense, but they're all the family that I have. And if anybody is attacking any parent, any mother or father, the whole family suffers. I do believe that when a consecrated man or woman or a rabbi is being attacked by a clergy killer, they're attacking that congregation, they're attacking that family. I believe that.
Ministers are occasionally advised by various people within the church that they should not bring a lawyer into the matter, or it's going to become much more serious. I think that's a mistake. And I think actually there are many lawyers who are prepared to work with congregations and ministers to resolve issues as quickly as possible.
I feel blessed because I have had a bishop who has been supportive of me and backed me up. But that's not the case with the vast majority of our clergy in these situations. I work with pastors all around the country, week to week, who call in lamenting their situations. And when you trace the clergy killer phenomenon back to not necessarily the origins, because the origins are evil, but who are the clergy killers trying to influence or intimidate? Ultimately, it's the leaders of the church to get rid of the pastor. When the officials cave, when the officials refuse to back up the pastor, that makes the pastor vulnerable. When the pastor hires a lawyer, that makes the conference, the judicatory, the rabbinate vulnerable. And they're vulnerable because, as a part of that legal process, there's this procedure called discovery. And discovery is exactly what it sounds like. Tell us everything you know. What did you know and when did you know it? I got to believe if you've been a minister for more than 2 years, you've run into clergy killers, or you've heard about clergy killers. You've seen clergy killers. And if you're in a denominational office, you know where they are. And it's just a matter of to what degree they're out there. In the process of an outsider meaning outside the circle of the church, outside of the influence of the office. My bishop, I have accountability to my bishop, my superintendents. I have to answer to them. An attorney doesn't. An attorney's job is to seek and find and reveal the truth. And the truth in these situations is ugly, is deplorable, is sad, and probably sometimes even could be called criminal.
Why not? What would lead you to believe that clergy should accept the abusive situations that they find themselves in, a workplace that's not safe, it's not healthy, and that they have to listen to everything their employer says without challenge, without charge, and if they feel that they have a real grievance, because that's the only time you'll move, then you have to hire your own lawyer to defend you from the people you're ministering to, as well as the hierarchy of the church. Someone would have to explain to me what other organization, what other group of professionals or group of workers would allow that themselves to be in that situation.
There's no admonishment of the clergy killers by the denominational officials, no letters that are sent by denominational officials admonishing them for their behavior. Literally no action is taken against those who have done this. And so that just encourages them to do it again and again and again, because there's literally no accountability for the clergy killer on anybody's part. And so why not continue? If they know denomination is not going to back up whatever pastor they send in there, they're free to do whatever they want to do.
I think that it is very important for the church to constantly be monitoring its process, trying to improve it. And I think at this point, what that requires from my perspective is to take better care of the ministers who are involved in the process and to see to it that those who make unwarranted complaints or pursue complaints beyond reason are held financially and morally accountable for what they've done.
But a pastor that hires an attorney is a stopping block there. And that stopping block is discovery, information, and truth. And that's revealing, and it's ugly, and it's hard, and it's painful. But pain is a necessary part of the process of healing. It's one we've got to go through if we're going to get to the other side of this coin. Because I don't believe our bishops and our superintendents are bad people. I believe they're just like us, and no one is willing to say there's a drunk uncle in the living room that we've got to deal with, and hope and pray that over time it changes and gets better. Nothing changes until you begin to make steps to change it, and a lawyer can force that. A pastor cannot.
Scripture says that we should settle with our opponents while on the way to court. I think clergy people, we exhaust every possible measure before retaining a lawyer. We turn the other cheek, we forgive thousands of times, hoping that the clergy killers will just stop what they're doing. Clergy killers will not stop, and I would advise any ordained person being attacked by a clergy killer to retain a lawyer and let that be the first step.
That particular teaching of the church grows out of 1 Corinthians, where Paul told people not to go to the courts. The situation was different. Churches were outlaw movement. To go to the state which was against the church is one thing. So the context is entirely different. And I am deeply upset by the hypocrisy of the institution that plays these spiritual terms but has its own team of lawyers to protect their behinds and not their clergy. And then they say to the clergy, we're spiritual. And the power differential also. None of the perpetrators in the establishment pay anything out of their own pockets. But if a clergy person decides to consult a lawyer, it comes out of their personal pocket, and they're blackballed as well in the process.
There's no advocacy for clergy, and there's no body of solidarity. And that's a fact. And yet it's a certain type of work that is probably similar to nursing maybe, and teachers, very vulnerable to attack. But there's nobody there if you get isolated and you get attacked. There's nobody there for you.
This is anguish of the deepest kind, the suffering kind, when pastors in the middle of the night have to pray, my God, why have you forsaken me?
In the midst of a clergy killer phenomena, the minister can often begin to feel forsaken everywhere. It's as though God had forgotten he existed. It is as though there were no power available to him, as though the Holy Spirit was not indwelling. It's a difficult time. He feels almost like Jesus did upon the cross when he yelled out, my God, why have you forsaken me? To be spiritually deprived is much like an ancient church father wrote when he described the dark night of the soul.
When they do come in, it's about finding a way to contain the anguish and the sense of betrayal and the sense that they've failed. Spiritually, I think that they just want to say, why have you forsaken me? I mean, it's right out of the scripture, that sense of being crucified. I'm hanging here and nobody cares. Nobody gives a damn. And to be able to be present to that is a great privilege for me, but it's also painful work in being there in that sort of belly of the dragon.
For a church people to come out and say that ministers have to expect to be abused because Jesus was crucified. Oh, I cannot get over that. And listening to what people had to say about this whole notion that ministers needed to suffer in order to fulfill their ministry. Have these people such little appreciation? Do they put such petty value on Christ's crucifixion that they feel that they have to sacrifice a minister every now and then, toss him or her up on that cross and somehow renew the sacrifice?
We're called upon, whether we're ministers, priests, or rabbis, to sacrifice. That's a big word in all our traditions. But sacrifice does not mean abandoning our humanity, and does not mean abandoning justice. When Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, they shall inherit the earth," he didn't say, "Blessed are the doormats, for they shall inherit the earth." The meek are those who understand that solidarity must be for the vulnerable. And the clergy leader, rabbi, priest, minister, needs to stand up not only for his or her own rights, in doing that both civilly and in the church, that same clergy person is doing it for the congregation and is a witness to the world.
A pastor's integrity is the most important thing that he or she has.
As a minister, when your character and your integrity are questioned, if there's any incredulous thoughts that come as a result of that, then it impugns you. It has an impact on how effectively you're able to pastor people. Because if you don't have your integrity, if you're not of sound character, then it's hard for you to be an effective pastor.
That where there is an obvious and sustained assault against the integrity of the pastor and of the congregation, that the loving thing to do, we call it tough love, is to remove the clergy killer and their associates from a position of wreaking havoc in the congregation, with an openness and a prayerful concern that they will come to their senses and perhaps bring themselves to repentance, and possibly then restoration can take place. I have not always felt this way, but seeing my other clergy members coming along, as a senior minister in his retired state, I should do more to help make sure that those who dedicate themselves to Christ are not yielding themselves to a kind of hellhole named a church.
I think when a lot of people who are in ministry now got out of seminary, there was a glut of ministers. There were plenty. But in this day and age, clergy are becoming rare. A lot of people are not going into seminaries. A lot of young people are choosing not to go into ministry. And I think churches are finding it more and more difficult to find pastors. And the idea that, we can just replace the pastor, I think is going to be something that changes.
In terms of the history of Christianity, it's always been ebb and flow. When there are prosperous times in the church, there often is more intense corruption and more intense authoritarian behavior. But that can also occur in desperate times. But in desperate times, when the church recovers its countercultural impulse, the impulse to be an alternative to the paradigm or the narrative of the given society, that's when it's strongest. And I think Reverend Knipe nailed it on the head. In other words, if it's about money, if it's about pleasing people, you're going to give them spiritual pablum. And if you do that as a pastor, church leader, your moral authority comes crashing down, as it does in the whole institution. But when you have that countercultural impulse with expectations, as Reverend Knipe said, but expectations of discipline to do justice, to support the vulnerable, to speak out prophetically, then even if you lose some members, the members who stay will be galvanized. Small groups change the world. And I think we've lost that kind of moral courage.
So earlier we talked about compromising the moral authority of the church because there's been no accountability. Isn't this discussion right now about the same thing? We're talking about, is it good, is it profitable for the church to call a clergy killer what it is? Aren't we coming down to accountability?
My experience has been when I consistently name the behaviors in public,
The clergy killer will name themselves by loud protest against my doing that very thing within the congregation. And therefore they name themselves as the clergy killer, as evil, by protesting against behaviors that they would like to engage in and don't want to be chastised for.
As Sloyd has pointed out, we need to be trained to deal with clergy killers. We need to be trained against the powers of wickedness in high places and how to deal with that. And there's where discipline comes in and community comes in. I think both of those are so incredibly important.
We don't need to lose sight of the very good people, solid and supportive, that really have a longing to make the congregations what they ought to be. So for me, I can never even speak about clergy killers without those who are healers and supporters, those who are with you and who keep you from sinking down.
We're in the process of killing off our spiritual leaders, and without them, we lose something that's very important, whether we are believers, Christians, Muslims. We need spiritual leaders to remind us that this world is about something bigger than ourselves.
We are clergy because of a divine calling. That calling puts us in a special, sacred relationship to the individuals in our congregation as well as the congregation as a whole.
When you pick up the cross of Christ, that's a commitment. That's something that I believe that you continue to do for the rest of your life on this earth.
I think people need to understand that a call to the priesthood, a call to ministry, it's not a career. It's our vocation. It's our very life. It's an incredible gift from God.
The preacher who really believes that he or she is there by divine appointment can weather the storm a little bit better because you've got a place of succor, a place of comfort and encouragement.
I do feel a special mission to preach to preachers, priests, and rabbis and congregations about this problem of clergy killers, because ultimately we're all in this together. And as I had said earlier, when one of us is attacked, when one of us is destroyed or almost destroyed, we all are.
When I came to this congregation, after having gone through a forced termination at the previous congregation, I asked for us to have a group that would specifically deal with conflict in the church. And the first session that I did to teach this group how to handle conflict was to teach them about clergy killers, about psychopath lights, these people out there who hate authority and they will do anything to destroy authority. And ministers in the church are the prime person for them to go after. And this congregation has seen one in the past, didn't realize what they had seen, and then when I explained it to them, they said, "Oh, we know what you're talking about."
Trusted friend, mentor came to me on a Sunday afternoon. He said to me, he closed the door. He said, "You've got to forgive those people for what they've done." I said, "You have no idea what these people did to me and to my family, to my children. You have no idea." He said, "No, I don't have any idea what they did to you. But I see what it's done to you. And I see what it's doing to you here in your current church." And he said, "Not for their sake, but for your own. You've got to forgive those people. Find some way in your heart." He said, "I'm not here to tell you how to do it. I'm just here to warn you. It's eating you alive."
The voice they hear that they think is God's is their own. And maybe that's the most evil thing that there is. That our own voice is all we have to go on. I think history proves that our own voice isn't a very reliable one. Our own voice calls for Barabbas. our own voice says, I don't know him. And it's only God's voice that says, Sunday's coming, and there will be a resurrection. I think as clergy people, that's the voice we have to hear. And I think as clergy killers, that's the voice they don't ever hear anymore.
I absolutely believe in the existence of evil, and I absolutely believe, however, in the ultimate power that comes from the Holy Spirit that will always eventually and ultimately triumph over evil.
Magnificat anima mea Domino.
Evil never prevails. That's the message we need to know and to recognize and to understand. Sometimes in this world, sometimes in this life, it looks like evil is prevailing. But if you believe the Bible, if you read the Word of God, you know the end of the story. And the end of the story is that Jesus wins. In fact, he's already won. He won when he was resurrected from the dead after being crucified. And that needs to be an encouragement for those of us who would take on this vocation and subject ourselves to these circumstances where evil will come after us.
This is not a limitless time. There comes a time we really do need to say, clergy killers, there is an end to this, and we can take responsibility for it. But I think we're going to have to act. I'm really convinced we're going to have to act.
Amen.